Hi, it's Nicole. A lot of things happened since our last wrap-up. I went to Edinburgh and visited a few independent bookshops of various shapes and sizes. Edinburgh has this thing called the 1 o'clock gun. They fire a gunshot every day at 1 p.m. from Edinburgh Castle, which looms over the city. I was there for a few days, and one day I even set an alarm and got out of a restaurant to hear it, but so far I have failed. When I was in Edinburgh, I also saw my first Shakespeare's First Folio in the National Library of Scotland. That was in November to celebrate the 400th anniversary of the publication of the First Folio. Since then, I have seen another First Folio in the British Library in London. The one in Edinburgh is open at different pages depending on when you see it, so when you go and visit. For example, when I went, I saw the pages of Friends, Romans, Countrymen in Julius Caesar. If you go now, by now I mean January or February 2024, you will see the title page of Macbeth. The one in London is open at the title page right at the beginning, and I think it stays like that, partly because side by side they also display Shakespeare's second, third and fourth folio. I didn't even know they were a thing. All on the same page, so you can see and compare. It was great fun to play spot the difference. For videos, I did a flurry of wrap-ups, all the plays I watched last year, my favorite books in various categories, then I set my reading goals and plans for the new year. We had a good look at the novel Mrs. Dalloway, and last week I introduced a lesser-known English poet called John Clare in a video that a lot of you seem to enjoy. We are also in the middle of a small celebration of the 100th video and 2,000 subscribers on this channel. Thanks very much for all your responses. I'm working on them. Watch this space. Today, here are the books I read in December 2023 and January 2024. First of all, Gormenghast. Gormenghast is a 1950 novel by British writer Mervyn Peake, the second in his Gormenghast series. The first one is called Titus Groan, which is the name of the protagonist of Gormenghast. Gormenghast is the name of an ancient castle where Titus and his family and his ancestors lived. Titus is the 77th Earl of Groan and Lord of Gormenghast Castle. The story goes from when he's 7 till he's 17. It's a coming-of-age story of a boy finding his way between the pride in his heritage and the rebellion against meaningless traditions. I much prefer Gormenghast to Titus Groan. The castle was so cold and dark and loveless in the first book. It was unbelievable that the two children would survive. There are a lot more human relationships in the second book. Not necessarily loving, but at least there are finally people inhabiting the place. There are children running around, there are school teachers despising each other, there are ridiculous or unhealthy romantic relationships. There's genuine love expressed in awkward ways. But at least there are people. The writing is very atmospheric, whether it's the darkness of the castle or the power of the storm and the flood. You feel the atmosphere of the moment as the characters do. I'll read you a paragraph about a storm and another paragraph about the world after the storm. The roaring and hissing of the rain was mounting steadily in volume, and the noise of it upon the stones and the earth outside the mouth of the cave made all but the most violent of the thunder peals inaudible. A hare with its ears laid along its back sat motionless with its eyes fixed upon the fox. The cave was filled with the noise of the elements, and yet there was a kind of silence there, a silence within the noise, the silence of stillness, for nothing moved. After the storm, There was no more rain. The washed air was indescribably sweet. A kind of natural peace, almost a thing of the mind, a kind of reverie, descended upon Gormenghast. Descended, it seemed, with the sunbeams by day and the moonbeams after dark. By infinitesimal degrees, moment by golden moment, hour by hour, day by day, and month by month, the great flood waters fell. The extensive roofscapes, the slates and stony uplands, the long and slanting sky fields, and sloping attitudes dried out in the sun. It shone every day, turning the waters that were once so grey and grim into a smooth and slumbering expanse, over whose blue depths the white clouds floated idly. I can imagine that on a cinema screen. The next one is Precious Bane. Precious Bane is a historical romance by Mary Webb. It was published in 1924, so this is its 100th anniversary, if you care about that sort of thing. The story is set in rural England, Shropshire to be precise, during the Napoleonic Wars. It's about a young woman with hair-shortened lips called Prue San. The story has a Cinderella pattern. Prue fell in love with a man whom she thought herself not worthy of, but after all the hardship and heartache, the prince stooped down and chose her. There was a dramatic rescue at the end where she was literally picked up onto a horse, like in a Disney fairy tale. The countryside setting and the farm labourer crowd have a Thomas Hardy vibe to it. The opening chapter, where the protagonist in her old age sits by the fire and the rest of the book is her remembering her past. That setup reminds me of The Go-Between by L.P. Hartley. She also has a brother and they live next to a river. That reminds me of The Mill on the Floss by George Eliot. There are some stunning paragraphs. You get the beautiful prose, the L.P. Hartley and Thomas Hardy vibe in her foreword. The past is only the present become invisible and mute. And because it is invisible and mute, its memoried glances and its murmurs are infinitely precious. We are tomorrow's past. Even now, we slip away like those pictures painted on the moving dials of antique clocks. A ship, a cottage, sun and moon, a nosegay. The dial turns, the ship rises up and sinks again. The yellow-painted sun has set, and we, that were the new thing, gather magic as we go. This is the passage when Prue first met Kester and fell in love instantly. The delightful bit is not the love at first sight, but the mention of the book of Revelation in the Bible and why she loved it. I wondered what he'd heard of Gideon. So this is Prue wondering what Kester had heard of Gideon. Gideon is her brother. I wondered what he'd heard of Gideon. Oh, in a minute, it was more to me that he should like Gideon and Mother and me than that I should master the reading of Revelations, which beat me still, because of the strange words and the roundabout way of the telling. I'd laboured over it a long while, and labour brings a thing near the heart's core. Above and beyond that, I wanted to know the mind of John. He being lonesome on his billet in the sea as we were at sun, and having many thoughts in his mind, both deep and bright. Now one like TV had no thoughts at all, and you soon tire of looking in an empty porringer. And Mother had 2 thoughts, or 3, and Gideon 2. So the mind of John had drawn me as none other did afore. But now the book of Revelations was but a window straw to this man's whim. I read Precious Bane because of Cold Comfort Farm. There's a one-line mention of Precious Bane in the introduction to Cold Comfort Farm, saying, "Here was a book that was generally described as a wicked parody of the rural novels of Mary Webb, Precious Bane, The Golden Arrow, which were immensely popular in Britain between the wars, but had since sunk rightfully into obscurity. Now I have read it, and I put Cold Comfort Farm and Precious Bane side by side, I can appreciate the wicked wit of Cold Comfort Farm even more. For example, if you contrast the closing scenes where in Precious Bane, the innocent, obedient, and helpless Prue son was rescued by her hero and scooped up on a horse, leaving her family home to collapse into the wood. In Comfort Farm, the spirited Flora single-handedly sorted out all the unhappy people on the farm, let the sunshine and breeze into the gloom, and was whisked away by her man in a helicopter, arranged in advance by herself. It's not the kind of book I'd usually choose to read, but for the exercise, it was worth it. Next one, Mrs. Dalloway. Mrs. Dalloway is about a day in the life of Mrs. Dalloway and various characters in London. I made an entire video on Mrs. Dalloway, talking mostly about death. In the same video, I also read out a few passages from Virginia Woolf's letters and diary entries during the time she worked on the novel. I'll link it here. Virginia Woolf is considered one of the most important 20th century modernist authors and is well known for her stream of consciousness. Stream of consciousness, for those who are not familiar with it, is a kind of monologue, but not the kind in Shakespeare plays where the character speaks thought through coherent sentences with a point and good logic to the audience. Thoughts in a stream of consciousness monologue are usually more scattered and the subjects are usually trivial. A stream of consciousness monologue is a bit like hearing someone talking to themselves. I read a few of her essays, including A Room of One's Own. For her novels, I so far read To the Lighthouse, Orlando, and Mrs. Dalloway, in that order, which I recently realized is the reverse of the publication order. I always found her writing quite hard to grasp and pin down, even her essays. Essays usually have a point, so I thought if I could follow her train of thought and argument, they should be easier to understand. Yes, they are easier than her novels, but they are still hard work. Between To the Lighthouse, Orlando, and Mrs. Dalloway. Mrs. Dalloway is the easiest to follow for me, but that could be because I'm a more experienced reader now than when I read To the Lighthouse 2 years ago. I won't repeat what I said in that video, but at the end of that video I said there's a lot more to discuss. One thing is the motif of the window. I'll briefly mention what I mean here. By the end of the novel, I couldn't help but notice the importance of windows. A lot of key scenes happen next to a window, or things, people and life are seen through windows. For example, on the first page, one of the first things Clarissa Dalloway did is to open the windows, and that squeak of the hinges reminded her of Burton. As she walked in London's streets, she saw shopkeepers and their jewellery and gloves in the windows. She saw "Fear no more, the heat of the sun" written on a book page through a shop window. When Mrs. Dalloway was in The Florist, the perspective shifts to Septimus, and he saw her through the florist's shop window. Our two protagonists are on the opposite side of a window. The most obvious is the suicide of Septimus. He jumps out of the window. That was the only way of escape. It's a very sad paragraph to read. Septimus was mentally ill and the doctors were of no help at all, in a desperate attempt to avoid being captured by the doctor and sent to a lunatic asylum. Getting up rather unsteadily, hopping indeed, from foot to foot, he considered Mrs. Filmer's nice clean bread knife, with bread carved on the handle. But one mustn't spoil that. The gas fire? But it was too late now. Holmes was coming. Razors he might have got, but Razia, who always did that sort of thing, had packed them. There remained only the window, the large Bloomsbury lodging house window. The tiresome, the troublesome, and rather melodramatic business of opening the window and throwing himself out. It was their idea of tragedy, not his or Razia's, for she was with him. Holmes and Bradshaw liked that sort of thing. He sat on the sill. But he would wait till the very last moment. He did not want to die. Life was good, the sun hot. Only human beings? Coming down the stairs opposite, an old man stopped and stared at him. Holmes was at the door. "I'll give it you," he cried, and flung himself vigorously, violently, down onto Mrs. Filmer's area railings. And I read out another passage in full in my Mrs. Alloway's video, the instance when she saw the old lady getting ready for bed as her party raged on in the background. They looked at each other again through a window. I am not 100% sure, but I think each window leads to a different world. A world of the past in one's memory, a world of possible future, a world of stopping being alive, but curiously not of despair and death. What do you think? Next one, the essential Emily Dickinson. How did I get interested in Dickinson? This feels like cheating. I got interested in Emily Dickinson because of the TV series. I loved it. I loved how modern, wacky, and full of energy it is. I loved how words and verses came to her and flowed out of her, and how the team achieved that effect on the screen. I've only read most of the poems in this little book once. They are short, but so dense, and there are so many of them. It took me longer to read this than a full-length novel. I recognized some of them because of the TV series, and I had to admit I liked those more because there was a story attached to each poem. I have no idea if the writers for the TV made the stories up or if they were based on her personal life and history. That's beside the point. Kind of. The point is, some of them are so beautiful. I don't pretend to get all of them or even half of them, but the ones I do, how do you put such simple words together and create those fresh meanings and the spine-tingling effect? I'm not jealous at all. I listened to The Poet's Corner by John Lithgow. It was a poetry collection recommended by two of you. Caroline says, there is a fantastic audiobook called Poet's Corner. He, or other famous actors, reads a variety of poets, tells you a bit about the poet, and does a brief analysis of the poems he chooses. I love it because you get to hear different poets and see what you like, and he helps so much with his overview. I love poetry, but often feel I get in a rut, so I re-listen to this audiobook to refresh my reading. And Bonnie says, I just thought of a book about poetry that I think you would enjoy, The Poet's Corner. In this book, he selects his favorite poems and gives a brief history of the poet and poem. What I love about my favorite poems is the way they make me feel. John helps me understand why a poem makes me feel that way, feel the way it does. Thanks very much, Caroline and Bonnie. You were right. I thoroughly enjoyed it. The poets included are listed in alphabetical orders from Matthew Arnold to William Butler Yeats. I didn't count how many poets are included in total. Some of them I'm more familiar with than others. I got to know a few spectacular poems and poets for the first time. Bonnie mentioned E.E. Cummings to me before. I heard If Everything Happens That Can't Be Done by him for the first time. It was one of those rare moments that was utterly delightful. Another jaw-dropping moment was hearing a Chinese poem from 7th to 8th century, translated into English by Ezra Pound in 1915, called The River Merchant's Wife. It was a revelation. I did translation work and I dearly love Chinese language as well as English. I just didn't believe translation could do justice to Chinese poems. Nothing to do with the skills and talents of the translators. They are just two very different languages. But my goodness, I am so convinced now it can be done. Maybe I should set this as my lifelong ambition to translate Chinese poems into English so you can enjoy them too. When I Was 120 by A.E. Housman, Love Is Not All by Edna St. Vincent Millay, Annabel Lee by Edgar Allan Poe. These left deep impression as well. John Clare is an English poet from the early 19th century known as the peasant poet. He was born the son of a farm labourer in 1793 and died in 1864 at age 70. His biographer Jonathan Bate described him as the greatest labouring class poet that England has ever produced. No one has ever written more powerfully of nature, of a rural childhood, and of the alienated and unstable self. Nature, childhood, and alienated and unstable self are the key words Jonathan Bate gave Clare's works. I read you a poem of nature called The Nightingale's Nest in the standalone video. I'm going to read you a small section about childhood here. It's about the simple games John Clare used to play with his playmates. It reminds me of my own childhood, busy with nothing but stones and grass and paper for hours with my cousins. It seemed nothing until Clare looked back at it years later and described it in his iconic ways. Our fancies made us great and rich. No bounds our wealth could fix. A stool drawn round the room was soon a splendid coach and six. The magic of our minds was great, and even pebbles they, soon as we chose to call them gold, grew guineas in our play. And carriages of oyster shells, though filled with naught but stones, grew instant ministers of state, while clay kings filled their thrones. Like Cinderella's fairy queen, joy would our wants bewitch. If wealth was sought, the dust and stones turned wealth and made us rich. The mallow seed became a cheese, the henbane's loaves of bread. A burdock leaf our tablecloth on a table stone was spread. The bindweed flower that climbs the hedge made us a drinking glass, and there we spread our merry feast upon the summer grass. The fairest summer sinks in shade, the sweetest blossom dies, and age finds every beauty fade, that youth is deemed a prize. The play breaks up, the blossom fades, and childhood disappears. For higher dooms ambition aims, and care grows into years. But time we often blame him wrong, that rude destroying time, and follow him with sorrow's song when he has done no crime. Our joys in youth are often sold in folly's thoughtless fray, and many feel their hearts grow old before their heads are grey. The past, there lies in that one word, joys more than wealth can crown, nor could a million call them back, though muses roll them down. The sweetest joys imagined yet, the beauties that surpassed, all life or fancy ever met, are there among the past. On that note, that's all for today. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in my next one.